Well, it's great to see so many people out here. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington, which is where you are. You found it. And this is part of our Ford Evening Book Talk series, sponsored by the Ford Motor Company and the Ford family, who've been great patrons of Mount Vernon since Henry Ford donated the first fire engine to the estate, which is a crucial concern, keeping this wonderful artifact from burning to the ground. And in fact, if you go on our webpage now, you'll see that we are still raising money and currently raising money for a new fire suppression system. And if you're looking to find a good donation, I can't think of a better one than to keep George Washington's house from burning to the ground. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, as many of you know, and maybe some of you who are new here do not, has never taken government money. It is one of the great examples of the public-private partnership that has made America such a powerful cultural resource with great cultural institutions, educational institutions. And so we really encourage everyone to become members of Mount Vernon, to support our efforts here to educate people about the life, leadership, and legacy of Mount Vernon. I'd like to point out special guest in the audience tonight, Kurt Vibrantz, President and CEO, in the back there, who's in charge of that great trust. Yeah. Now, look at that cheap applause for Kurt. He always enjoys that. I also want to say that we are being live streamed to people around the world, to all the ships at sea and everybody out there streaming in. So this is an exciting program. Now, I was just recently out at the Distilled Spirits Council in D.C. There's very few things that would get me to leave the Distilled Spirits Council. I'm rushing back to Mount Vernon, but one of them is really to hear Aaron David Miller talk about The End of Greatness, which is a fantastic book. For those of you who've read it, I know you're going to agree, and you really have a treat in front of you. So who is Aaron David Miller? He is a PhD from the University of Michigan, BA, MA, and PhD from Michigan. Currently Vice President for New Initiatives and a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. For 2 decades before that, he served in the Department of State as an analyst, negotiator, advisor on Middle East issues to Republican and Democratic secretaries of state. Between 2003 and 2006, he served as president of the Seeds of Peace, which is an internationally recognized program in conflict resolution and coexistence, something that we still need much more of for certain. In 2006, he joined the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which is a tremendous institution in itself that brings together the public and academic thinkers on all the contemporary problems of our age. He's a frequent commentator on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and NPR. His articles have appeared in every publication you read, and many others, the Washington Post, the Times, the Los Angeles Times. His column Reality Check appears weekly in the Foreign Policy magazine. Recipient of numerous awards and honors. 2 I want to mention. One is the Department of State's Distinguished Meritorious and Superior Honor Award and the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. He's the author of numerous books, many on Middle East policy, and of course, this evening, his latest work, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Please, everyone, welcome Aaron David Miller. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was too kind and overly generous. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back here. I launched this book here in an interview with Margaret Warner and Lara Newshour, and it's wonderful to be back. I also had another historic experience at Congress Hall selling this book, which was really quite extraordinary. Sitting there with David Eisenhower, who moderated the discussion, literally in front of the dais or the podium where John Adams was inaugurated president. It's really an extraordinary. I can imagine the spirits when they closed the place down. The spirits of our presidents and founders consort, I'm sure, in the wee hours of the morning. I spent almost 40 years in Washington, 20 of them working for a half a dozen secretaries of state, Schultz to Powell. And that's a long time. I mean, I'm 66. I have a 35-year-old daughter and a 32-year-old son. To do anything for 20 to 25 years is a long time. That experience shaped my philosophy of life, and it shaped my approach to this book in several ways. First, it led me to the idea that whether it's in marriage, business, friendship, or diplomacy, success really is trying to find the balance between the way the world is on one hand and the way you want it to be on the other. If you only look at the way the world is, nothing ever changes. Not in personal relationships and certainly not in diplomacy. If you look, however, at the world in terms of the way you see it, then you will fail every single time. And the American enterprise really is a question of finding the balance between the way the world is and the way we want it to be. I'm a Niebuhrian at heart, or at least I've become one. Niebuhr argued a long time ago that the best America can do, and I think this is actually pretty good if we could manage it, is to find proximate solutions to insoluble problems. I think that is partly the American story, and I'll have more to say on this when we get to the issue of great presidents. Second is the notion of bipartisanship. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. I worked for Republicans and Democrats. I am absolutely persuaded that neither party has a monopoly on truth, justice, or the solutions to this country's problems. And I would argue to you, particularly on the foreign policy side, and it's in the current, it's part of the woof and weave of this book, that in essence, the dividing line for our foreign policy and perhaps even our domestic policy isn't between liberal and conservative, left and right, Republican and Democrat. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. The only thing that matters is how America gets on the smart side. And that's extremely important. It does require partisanship, perhaps in the service of bipartisanship, and I would argue that all of our greats, are certainly undeniably great presidents, understood this in ways that many other presidents couldn't or wouldn't. And finally, I guess I come to the issue of leadership. I will reserve my comments on that in a minute, because I think why don't we just begin? And I don't want to have to repeat myself. The origins of this book, though, really didn't lie in an American story. It lay in the Middle East. And in my work on Arab-Israeli negotiations and diplomacy, I concluded, looking back on 20 plus years, that when we succeeded, we in essence succeeded because we had partners who were masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their constituencies. And this is incredibly important. John Keegan, if he were here, would argue to you that 6 men between the years 1920 to 1956 defined the fate of much of the Western world. They were responsible for catastrophe, for genocide. They were responsible for prospects of peace and prosperity. 6 individuals. 6. It's extraordinary when you contemplate what that in essence means. Now, Marx, not Groucho Marx, Karl Marx, would argue in some respects the opposite. He would argue, and did, writing in the 19th century, that men make history, but rarely, he was writing in the 19th century, so forgive me, men make history, but rarely as they please. It is in essence the interaction between the individual and individual agency and circumstance, in my judgment, that is probably the best explanation for why things happen. So I looked around the world and I tried to divine whether or not the kind of transformative leaders, both for good or ill, that existed much of the 20th century and earlier, where were they? What happened to them? And I came to the conclusion that we were confronting, in many respects, a global leadership deficit. 193 countries sit in the UN. I'm not sure any of them I could defend as truly transformative leaders. There are plenty who are involved and have become masters at maintaining their own power. Vladimir Putin is one. Erdogan of Turkey is another. But good and great leaders capable of moments of transformation with respect to their own societies, let alone beyond their societies, where did they go? Mandela's death, I would argue, is probably a good indication of what has happened. And his passing and the attention that it garnered was, I think, with sufficient justification and purpose. Mandela may have been the last truly transformative great leader that we've seen. From the global leadership deficit, and certainly the leadership deficit that existed 10 years ago and clearly exists now in the Middle East. It was only a hop, skip, and a jump, frankly, to the American experience. And here I confronted a number of anomalies. The presidency is the most dynamic agent in our political system, the Energizer bunny, if you will, of American politics. Congress is in and out of session. The Supreme Court is in and out of session. The presidency is not. We are, to some degree, obsessed with the presidency. It is the central feature in our political system. If we haven't come to that conclusion, I'm not saying this is good or bad, then the media has certainly brought us there. It's much easier to identify with a man who has a wife and a dog and kids than it is to identify with a Congress or with 9 jurists in black robes, some of whose decisions very intelligent people have a difficult time unpacking. So I looked around and I tried to understand what was the gap that existed between our aspirations for greatness and the realities that we confronted. And I quickly came to the conclusion that the demand for great presidents quickly exceeded the supply. There are any number of reasons for this, and any number of reasons for our anomalous approach to the presidency. We, in some respects, even while we yearn for greatness, we aspire to it. We want to be saved, and I would argue these days even more so than ever before. Americans have a hard time accepting power and accepting it in a gracious way in terms of the trappings of power. We're much more content and much, I suspect, much more comfortable with what I would call common uncommonness. So Jefferson opens the White House door in his slippers, and the British ambassador opens the door himself in his slippers, and the British ambassador is aghast. Cleveland is answering his own phone at the White House during his presidency. And Harry Truman decides when he leaves the White House in a gift of a New York Chrysler New Yorker, to take Bess and no one else, no Secret Service, no media, no advance team, and to go in the title of a wonderful book on his excellent adventure. He drives 1,200 miles up the eastern seaboard. He's pulled over for speeding on the New Jersey Turnpike. He eats in diners. This is the President of the United States. This is 1953. So the notion, we're ambivalent about greatness. We like this common touch. And that complicates our relationship, it seems to me, with the presidency. The Europeans do great. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Charlemagne. We don't do great here. We aspire to greatness, but we're still ambivalent about it. And I would argue to you that in essence complicates our relationship and our aspirations to want to have great presidents. The other problem is that our political class continues to disappoint us. And how can you measure and appreciate something that you cannot see? I use the word great, I would bet you 20 times a day. Have a great day, I'll say. It was a great movie. She's a great tennis player. I had a great time. What does it actually mean? What does the word great actually mean? I think we've trivialized it. We've emptied it out of any significance, in large part because we can't see it anymore in our political class. I briefed a group of military officers a year or so ago, and I asked them who was the last American political figure, not president, the last American political figure that they would attach the adjective great to. And I gave them 5 minutes to think about it, which I thought was a lot of time. These are all combat vets. They're very smart. And they couldn't think of one. Not one in the frame of their own personal experience. Not one. And they asked me, what about you? Is there any American political figure in the last 50 years that you would attach the word great to? And I said, yeah, I have one. And they said, who? I said, King. And they said to me, but he was murdered in 1968. And that's exactly the point. That is precisely the point. The last truly great inaugural address delivered by any president. And remember, we're not talking about an impromptu speech. We're talking about an address around which presidents and their speechwriters spend enormous amounts of time in preparation, wordsmithing, trying to find the right conception. What was the last great inaugural address delivered by an American president in the United States of America? I mean, I know what my answer is. You may have your favorites. It was Kennedy's Ask Not speech. It was Kennedy's Ask Not speech. How is that possible? How is that possible? And that failure now to appreciate, to see the kind of greatness that at one point or another characterized some of our political leaders is a serious problem as we try to figure out how to reconcile the gap between the presidents we want and the ones that we can realistically have. The book is driven by three basic propositions, all centered around the issue of greatness. The first assumption, and by the way, people have a hard time with this book. They truly do. Well, how can we not want another great president? And you're telling us the end of greatness has appeared. How do you know this? How can you divine the future? The answer is no. The headlines would suggest to me that we have a serious problem in our political system with producing the kinds of leaders that we need. The trend lines, however, that's what I'm more concerned about. It's the trend lines that are bad, and in a minute I'll explain why. Assumption number one, greatness in the American presidency is rare, has always been rare, because after all, greatness by definition is rare. Unparalleled, unprecedented accomplishment with a rarity and a distinction that is virtually surpasses the common, the good, certainly the mediocre. It's by definition rare. But it was real and measurable in our political system. I argue in the book we've had three undeniably great presidents. Only three. One a century. One in the 18th, one in the 19th, and one in the 20th. And my conceit here is quite simple. I talk about the three C's of greatness. And they are clearly in this order: crisis, character, and capacity. Three undeniably great presidents, and you know who they are, one a century, coincides with the three greatest challenges that this nation has ever faced. Without a doubt, these three confronted the most challenging crises, one in particular, the 19th century great president, confronted the greatest crises any nation could conceivably confront. And out of these crises, these men extracted a measure of transformational change. They transacted. They got through the crisis with the nation whole, but they transformed as well because they created a new point of departure in some very important and meaningful aspect of our politics, our social life, or our economics. Crisis, however, and I'll come back to this, is critically important. Without crisis, in my judgment, and you're beginning, I think, to see why it's called the end of greatness, why America can't have parens and doesn't want another great president, because in the nature of our system, what is required to move toward transactional and transformational change is a crisis so profound, so nation encumbering, so hot, so relentless that it encumbers everyone. It tames the political elites. It creates a measure of public acquiescence if the president has not just the crisis, but the other two elements, the character, and character here is a complicated concept. There's an internal dimension of character and an external. Characters in chief. All of these great presidents were, in essence, characters in chief. Lincoln loved the theater to a fault. Roosevelt loved the theater and loved people. Washington, and in the book, and I'm responsible for all of its errors and transgressions and interpretation, how I came to this conclusion, where I identified it, I cannot find it, but it is in the book and it is fundamentally wrong. It states categorically that Washington actually acted in plays. That is absolutely untrue, or I can't find evidence of it. But he admired the theater as well. So character is critically important, but so is capacity. How to actually do things, how to identify the right individuals to help you do things. And Those three C's have appeared 3 times in the nation's history. I'm arguing they haven't appeared again. More on the third proposition as to why we don't necessarily want another great president. So that's assumption 1. Greatness is real and measurable. I spend a part of the book talking about these men, what kept them and united them, and what divided them as well. Second, greatness is gone. That is my contention, or at least I can't find it. 12 presidents and down since our last undeniably great president, who was right. I mean, that's in some respects an easy one. The Republicans thought they were getting even with FDR when they began discussions and an initiative shortly after he died to make sure that no man or woman would ever again be able to serve 4 terms, or at least almost 4 terms. But in passing the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, they virtually priced FDR out of the market. No president ever again would get the opportunity, let alone the circumstances that FDR confronted, fortunately, fortuitously for us, to elevate him to greatness. Second, greatness is gone. So 12 presidents down and counting, I'm unable to identify an undeniably great president. I can identify presidents who did a great thing. I can identify presidents who were great at being president, but were not necessarily great presidents. I could identify presidents who were emblematic of their age. More on this in a minute. But the undeniable greatness is gone. Now, I have to be realistic here. If greatness, by definition, is rare, if nations are like individuals, we all go through formative experiences. If we survive them, we end up being physically vibrant, emotionally healthy, and nations are not that different. Do you need the kinds of leaders that we had to get America through the existential crises that it confronted in the 18th and 19th century? Maybe the myths and the tropes of greatness really are no longer necessary. Maybe what is required now is something else, a more collective leadership, goodness in the presidency, and I'll have more to say on that in a minute. But as far as I'm concerned, it's very hard to make the argument, and I identify 3 or 4 structural reasons as to why greatness is gone. One is the FDR High Bar. And let's be clear, FDR did not fix the Depression, but it was very much a confidence game in those days. And the 30s were turbulent, dark years, not only here, but throughout Europe as well. FDR experimented. He had the confidence of the nation, all, I might add, by a man who, after the age of 39, could not stand or walk unassisted, which is extraordinary in our political culture. We use words like a man or woman in good standing. We talk about expressions and formulations like what does he or she stand for? Not being able to stand is an extraordinary deficit in our political culture. And yet Roosevelt was able to accomplish this. The most successful war in American history that left the nation stronger at home and with more influence abroad, the last good war. When I asked Jimmy Carter how come there hadn't been a great president since FDR, he got it. His reaction was instantaneous because we haven't had a good war. We haven't had a good war. And the truth is FDR benefited from that, for sure. It got us out of the Depression. It allowed him a stage on which to act as a steward of the nation's interests. He had a lot of help, but it was remarkable. As one of the 6 men that John Keegan identified, it was really an extraordinary of leadership for as long as he led. We don't have what I call your grandfather's crisis anymore, and I would argue that's fortuitous. That's a good thing. We have plenty of crises, plenty. But since the end of the Second World War, I would argue to you we have not had a sustained nation-encumbering crisis, a crisis that forces us to turn the me, the M in me, upside down, so that it is a we. We fought the longest 2 wars in American history in Iraq and Afghanistan with 0.5% of a population of 320 million people. Where is the sense of shared obligation, of mutual sacrifice, of shared challenge? That's the kind of crisis that is required to energize the system, because the founders, in their infinite wisdom, fearing the consolidation and the increasing of power by individuals, including themselves, the royal governors and the king for sure, created a system which the great political scientist Edward Corwin described as an open invitation to struggle. Shared and separated powers. The only thing that shakes it loose is crisis, and not a crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which in a minute, it gave Kennedy an opportunity, his moment of greatness. But Cuba lasted 12 days. I'm not talking about a crisis like that. Even 9/11, which was the second bloodiest day in American history, exceeded by only one other day, September 17th, 1862, in which more Americans were killed at Sharpsburg than in any other day in American history. But even 9/11 was turned around. The inclusion that might have defined a national frame of reference became exclusive, volunteer military, which no professional military person I know or a politician wants to abandon. But there is a cost. There is a cost when the military is at war, but not the country. And that's extremely important. Johnson's brief flirtation with greatness was a consequence of a crisis in the inner cities. Kennedy's death enabled him to become the most transformative legislative president in American history. Vietnam, on the other hand, made it inconceivable that Johnson would be viewed as a great, undeniably great president. The personalization of the presidency, which has occurred in large part because of the media and the concentration of power, makes it very, very hard to create the detachment and mystique of leadership. De Gaulle was very, very convinced that you needed the mystique of leadership in order to promote greatness. We can't have that anymore because we have a 24/7 news cycle. FDR, picture the scene. It's 1936. FDR has secured the renomination. He's at Franklin Field outside of Philadelphia. There are 100,000 people waiting to cheer him on. He rides in a convertible, sitting on top of the car. He makes his way up to the dais to talk. He notices Edwin Markham, an aging American poet. He turns to talk to Markham, and his right brace begins to buckle. And his speech text in his hand falls. And the Secret Service, James Riley, and his son break the fall. Now, most of the people at Franklin Field didn't see the President of the United States on the ground, but the press saw it. Not a word the next day. And this notion of accessibility, yes, it can in fact inflate, and it can be a real asset and an advantage to a president, but it can also seek to trivialize. And I suspect the media has played its own role in both. Finally, our dysfunctional politics and the absence of trust in our basic institutions creates a situation where the system and the president are working at cross purposes. Forget big government, small government. Effective government as a force of remedy is something that is a generally shared principle. The one sign that I'll never get over is the Tea Party rally in the mall, and the placard read, "Obama, don't touch my Medicare." Now, this anomaly and this contradiction needs to be, and this is not a political statement, but it needs to be pointed out. 70% of us receive in some form, direct or indirect, some form of government benefit or subsidy. So the era of big government is here. The question is, can it be made to be more effective? And can we harness it in a way that's realistic? The problem is that we've lost faith in our institutions. It is no coincidence that the two most significant protest movements of the last 15, 20 years, the Tea Party on one hand and Occupy Wall Street on the other, are both directed at big corporations, big institutions, and big government. If you ask someone in 1966 the following question, do you have faith in your government to do the right thing most of the time? The stats are incredibly impressive. And this was in the middle of what would become a crisis in the presidency, beginning with Johnson and ending with Richard Nixon. Today, when they ask people that question, you get out of double digits, but barely. And that is a significant constraint against a president's capacity to achieve things and to remedy things. Finally, the third proposition, which is the most controversial, in a chapter I call What's So Great About Being Great? The question is, why wouldn't we want another great president? What conceivable reason would we have for not wanting a great president? Well, if I'm correct, then that greatness is a function of nation-encumbering crisis, and that it is essential to the system, then we truly don't want one. We really don't. In large part, I'm arguing that greatness in the presidency is too rare to be relevant, and in many respects too dangerous to be desirable. It distorts our frame of reference. It creates an illusion that somehow we need to be rescued by the one. It infantilizes us, frankly. And I think there's a certain amount of dysfunction there, particularly for a people that has relied through most of its history on individualism, resilience, and its own capacity to act. So if we don't want great, what do we want? And that's a very important question. I argue that we need to stop expecting our presidents to be great and literally allow them to be good, but not to be good in the commonplace, banal sense of the word. In three respects. Good in the sense that they are morally good and remain within the parameters of the law. Good in the sense that they're effective. He or she is good at that. And good in the sense that they understand themselves and are not haunted and chased by demons. And this is true of several of our more contemporary presidents. Their own demons got the best of them. And that's knowing themselves, knowing yourself is critically important. We call it emotional intelligence. I would call it discretion, prudence, and balance. And the greats, frankly, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, they had that sense of balance. And when I talk about good in the moral sense, I'm not necessarily talking about the narrow definition of character. There are any number of personal transgressions that presidents have made over the years, and it's arguable whether or not the public manifestation of their capacity was or was fatally affected by their own personal flaws and imperfections. I'm talking about remaining within the confines of the law. The word I is mentioned only once in the Constitution of the United States. Do you know why? Why would a personal pronoun mean we in the Declaration? Why would the word I be mentioned in the Constitution? I didn't know the answer to this question before I resurrected it to put in this book. Why would I? Because the founders embedded the inaugural oath in the document. And they did it in my judgment, for a reason. Because the ultimate source of authority isn't even the document. It's us. It's you and me. And I wrote this book to begin a conversation, not so much with respect to ranking our presidents, but trying to identify what is it about greatness in our politics and in ourselves that is critically important to good governance. Can we really have great presidents if somehow we've lost faith in our own sense of confidence and our own greatness? In a way, we've transferred our loyalties from our political class to our entertainers and our athletes. It is absolutely possible for us to appreciate greatness in our movie actors, in our musicians, and in our athletes. Now, those athletes sometimes fall, and there are any number of examples of greatness in athletics being not so great. But it's easy. That's an easy bargain. You buy a ticket. You read the sports pages, the entertainment sections. You go to events, and you can appreciate greatness. It's much harder to invest your faith, your emotional currency in our political class. I would argue that we must. And I'll close by recreating a conversation that I had with my daughter. She's a very talented author of fiction. She's 35. This was 10 years ago. We got into a conversation about how America has changed. And she said to me, your parents had the Great Depression and World War II. There were 130 million people in this country in 1941. 16 million of them put on a uniform, including my father. It's extraordinary when you think about it. So your parents had the Great Depression and World War II. They learned to do without. These were experiences from which they couldn't escape. You, pointing at me, Jenny said, you had civil rights movement, you had Vietnam, you had Watergate, you had the 60s. And then she said to me, and what do we have? What experience do we have? Where is the sense of shared obligation, shared sense of sacrifice, shared sense of mutual responsibility? That, I think, is the challenge, frankly, for the younger generation and for the nation as a whole. I'll close on an uplifting comment. The first and last president who was emotionally resonant with me was Jack Kennedy. I was 12 when he was assassinated. Kennedy described himself in a way that I think is a wonderful expression. I think, frankly, that's where the American experience is. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. Idealism without illusion. Never give up, because we don't have the right to give up. You don't have the right to say never. You don't have the right to say America can never have another great president. We occupy this space for a very brief period of time. And we can't mortgage the future by basically arguing that it's hopeless. But as you go through the process of trying to overcome these challenges in your own personal lives and in any larger enterprise, you have to go through it with your eyes wide open. I think our three undeniably great presidents did, and they left a lasting legacy and a standard that's not just to be admired, but I would argue to be followed. Thank you so much.
He's happy to take questions. We have some microphones since we're streaming this live. It helps the people listening online. Hear what you said. Wait.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I agree with what you say about needing a major crisis to have a truly great president. But taking that definition, sort of tautology that we're not going to have, or we have not had other great presidents since the end of World War II, because we haven't had a crisis of that sort. So looking at the human beings who we've had as president, and looking at them to whatever extent they're good, don't we really need more time so that historians can look at this and judge whether or not these flawed individuals, just as the three great presidents were flawed, will rise to the standard of being good? And I think of how we have been reevaluating Eisenhower, reevaluating Johnson, reevaluating Ford, for example. Those three who, at the time that they were in office, were by one side or another, were heavily criticized. And now, in retrospect, they look a lot better.
Yes.
So I'd be interested in what you have to say.
Well, the polls always indicate that once out of office, public responds in a much more positive fashion consistently. Because once presidents are freed from the partisanship and the fray, we tend, for many reasons, to become more forgiving and more tolerant. But you're absolutely right. a period of time is required to evaluate and review. Bill Moyers, who worked for Johnson, once said that there are only interim reports on presidents. I mean, I'm not a presidential historian. I have a PhD in American diplomatic and Middle Eastern history. But if you look at the historians' rankings, what you find is a measure of consistency that is terrifyingly consistent. That is to say, very few presidents have emerged from the bottom or the middle ranking to the top. And yet the same three presidents, by now we're talking, we have a period of a couple hundred years to measure their challenges. Is it possible that one of the last dozen presidents that we had will be reassessed and revised by some historian in a compelling way? I think it's possible that their reputations and their performance will improve. Whether or not they will get into the greatness category. I mean, I identify three presidents in the book that I would argue, since FDR, had what I call traces of greatness, real or perceived. Jack Kennedy is one. He's frozen in time forever. He is our ideal president. 50th anniversary of the assassination, the polls were extraordinary, not just among those who were present and sentient when Jack Kennedy was alive, but I'm talking about a younger generation who didn't know Jack Kennedy and yet knew of him. He's frozen forever in a pose that somehow has captivated the imagination. He dominated his age. He gave the last great inaugural speech that any president has given. Why is I still have a hard time trying to unwind that, because his persona and the age and his own identity seem to merge and meld. Johnson was the second president, I argue, had traces of greatness. He shepherded the country through the most traumatic event of Jack Kennedy's assassination. He was responsible for Medicare, Medicaid, 3 civil rights bills. Now, it's true, by 1966, the Democrats had lost the majority, and much of the Great Society, much of the other programs fell by the wayside. But Johnson stepped on the stage at a unique moment, and he had the turbulence in the streets. Thousands of individuals caught up in urban violence and the civil rights movement, literally promising the kind of crisis that he could take advantage of. And in a controversial judgment, although I don't think it's terribly controversial, identify Ronald Reagan as the third. Few presidents have dominated their age as Reagan did. And Reagan's pragmatism, along with his conservatism, was extremely helpful and beneficial. He also followed a lost decade in the presidency, which began with Jack Kennedy's assassination, through Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, through Richard Nixon in Watergate, through Ford's transitional presidency, through Carter's one-term presidency. Now, the Reagan acolytes, or those who accuse Reagan of being a cardboard president, will argue that a lot of this was hype. But he also was associated with some pretty extraordinary changes. He didn't end the Cold War, but his pragmatism allowed a hand to Gorbachev who did, in fact, make the crucial difference. So these three, I would argue, had traces of greatness. And the opinion ratings, particularly with respect to Kennedy and Reagan, even though Reagan was a very polarizing figure, bear that out. So I think, yes, there is room for revision. I sat on the stage with David Eisenhower. I did not include his grandfather. It was a subject of some sensitivity. He was very gracious and polite about it. We talked, and we agreed right then and there that prudence and not acting can also be an attribute of greatness, truly. I mean, Eisenhower was much more skilled, much more manipulative, much more in control than the image of the affable golf-playing president that dominated his age. He also presided over a decade that was sandwiched between the sacrifices of the 30s and 40s and the turbulence of the 60s. And that, in some respects, worked to his advantage. So is it possible that one of these 12, our current president, a decade from now, it'll take at least that to determine Barack Obama is going to be a historic president. That's clear. The question is whether he will be judged to be a great one. Will he be judged to have weathered a crisis and to have extracted out of that crisis some piece of transformative change? Will he be elevated above the fray to be appreciated by R's and D's alike as a national treasure? It took a long time. Remember, Lincoln and FDR were despised men, and Washington during his second term as well. So you can be partisan, but you have to be partisan in the service of a broader cause, and you have to emerge ultimately in a way that transcends the narrow partisan polarizing politics of your time. Maybe. I mean, I'm supposed to be a trained historian. I never practiced, but I do think in time. And I really do believe that thinking in time is really important. We'll see. Yes.
Professor, I very much appreciated your comments. They were quite refreshing. In addition to the three factors that you mentioned that typically have been invoked to measure greatness, it seems to me that there is another attribute that the three presidents in particular that you mentioned shared. And I think it goes a long way toward defining greatness, and that is the ability to inspire. I think greatness often can be measured by the effects that we see that are carried out by other people. And I often think about sports analogies. And I think of a man who was hired from the New York Giants coaching staff in 1958 to coach the Green Bay Packers. He inherited a team that was dead last. And less than 2 years later, that team became the champions of the NFL with essentially the very same personnel that he had inherited. Never once during those 2 years did he ever take the field, throw a pass, catch a ball, run a play. But he inspired, and he caused them to come out of their shells and do more than perhaps they thought they were capable of. I think when I look at the situation that we are confronting in this country today, and especially when I watch presidential debates, I feel like I know less about the candidates after the debate than I thought I knew beforehand. And much of that is because measuring effectiveness or winning a debate is more about not revealing much of your position, your plank, getting away unscathed so you can go out and make another speech. I think the presidents who were great in this country, truly great, were not afraid to fail. Certainly, FDR was willing to try virtually anything. And what was great is that if it didn't work, he'd try something else. Mm-hmm. Lincoln wasn't afraid to appoint members to his cabinet who politically violently disagreed with him. But he had courage.
Yes.
And so, to me, a great president, be it a man or a woman someday, will be someone who can inspire greatness in others. Or like Jim Valvano said, it's wonderful when you see ordinary people who are capable of accomplishing extraordinary things.
I mean, it's a very eloquent statement. Thank you. And I think the aspirational and the inspirational are really important. You know, they say that a leader without followers is just a man or woman out for a walk. And the fact is, followership, in the good sense of the word, is critically important. And a lot of it has to do with our own faith and our own capacity to want to participate in our own politics. But you're right, leaders can in fact inspire. Their characters can essentially be, Churchill said about FDR that meeting FDR for the first time was literally, listen to this, like opening up a bottle of champagne. That's an amazing image, opening up a bottle of champagne. That's what it was like to meet Franklin Roosevelt. But at the same time, and it's counterintuitive, these three undeniably great presidents were exceedingly private individuals. And Washington's definition of character was public appearance and abiding by the rules of civility. I think there was a lot more turbulence and emotional agitation beneath the surface. And I think recent scholarship has shown that Washington was not the wooden image that we have of him. Lincoln's sense of compassion and his sense of courage and the sense of loss during his own presidency gave him a capacity to inspire. His physical persona, and by the way, that's the other thing. These undeniably great presidents, their persona, their character, and the times merge into a kind of a seamless whole. Now, a lot of this, I gather, I don't want to get carried away here. They were inspirational and aspirational in large part because, let's face it, they actually succeeded. And I'm persuaded that the world's most compelling ideology isn't capitalism, democracy, or nationalism. It's success. That's the world's most compelling ideology, because success generates confidence, it generates fearlessness, it generates constituents. But the presidency is, as FDR indicated, a place of moral leadership. It is for men and one day a woman, a place to inspire, to teach, and to, in many respects, create that bond with the American public. We own the presidency. I guess that's what I'm trying to suggest. In many respects, and it's a reflection of us. And I think that notion is extremely important. We've never had a great one-term president. Why is that? Some people would argue for James Polk, because when he was elected, he said he would not run for his second term. He meant it. He accomplished the 4 things he set out to do, but he was a one-term president. You have to seek validation with the public again in order to have a chance to get into the great President's Club, because part of it is inspiring, part of it is bonding and intuiting what the public wants, and rising to their own expectations. You need the right circumstances to do that. But thank you very much for your comment. Yes.
One of the things you talked about was moral abilities. 2 of the presidents on your list to me had some great moral failings, and I was wondering how you would address those in the sense of them being greatness.
Yeah.
FDR did not take any action to stop the Holocaust, and you can say that millions died because of his inaction. Ronald Reagan never once said the word AIDS or provided any money for research, and again, millions died because of his failure to take action. Both of those are real great moral failures,
right?
Yet they're still considered great presidents.
We could argue the circumstances and how much power and influence either of those individuals had in responding to the challenges that you've identified. And the greats, the undeniably greats, had asterisks, for sure. I mean, I was struggling with this the other day because of the Confederate flag issue when it came to Washington. I was trying to persuade someone that we have a history. That history, in some respects, is going to define us. But the 18th and 19th century were, in this country, there were dark dimensions with respect to those centuries. And the question is, what do you do with the fact that 8 out of our first 14 presidents were slave owners? What do you do with that? How do you reconcile? I mean, why don't we tear down the Washington Monument? Washington was a slave owner. Washington flogged his slaves. Washington's slaves were critically important to his sense of happiness, and he talked about happiness, public happiness and private happiness. I mean, in the end, he grew to understand the moral failings of slavery, but he would never speak out against it. Why? Because for Washington, there was a broader objective, and that was what he would call accommodation, unity, and security of the nation, without which in the late 18th century, we would have had nothing. Lincoln triangulated constantly on the issue of slavery until he finally made his decision of what to do about it. FDR was a philanderer. I wouldn't cite necessarily his aversion to using American military power to bomb the concentration camps. John McCloy and most of the War Department made a compelling case that the best use of American assets was to end the war. Now, that was extremely problematic. But America confronts genocide in a very, our dealing with genocide is a very mixed and very troubled picture. Far more disastrous to Roosevelt's reputation was his decision, based in part on security considerations and part on political considerations, to imprison hundreds of thousands of Nisi and Isi on the West Coast. That is talk about a moral transgression in the absence of leadership. So that's, I guess, when you try to reconcile the perfect and the good, you have to make certain choices. I would argue that the best you could do, and in the book I don't try to make excuses for Washington's indulgence with respect to slavery or Jefferson's. The best I can do is to offer the following explanation. They both knew, Jefferson in particular as a young man, that it was wrong, but they left a political and moral framework within which they might actually have believed that over time, others would make the kinds of choices that would be required to create a new moral and ethical foundation for the nation. I mean, and as it was, I look at the Middle East, which is where I spent my career. I wonder how are these countries going to find a way to create transparency, good governance, respect for human rights, gender equality, when it took us, with all of our natural advantages, non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, fish to our east and west, these liquid assets, these oceans, which has given us tremendous advantage as a nation, unparalleled in history. It took us 150 years to begin to reconcile the reality that our Declaration of Independence talks about all men, 18th century again, being created equal, with the reality that our own Constitution, without using the word, validated one of the largest single chattel slavery enterprises that the world has ever known. It took us 150 years, 750,000 American dead, and by the looks of things, we have a very long way to go. So, in a way, again, I've given up on transformation. I don't think that's negative. I don't think it's defeatist. But in this country, change is slow. The founders virtually guaranteed it by the nature of the system that they created. And Reinhold Niebuhr, I think, was absolutely right. As the Protestant theologian, he understood the imperfections of men and women, and he argued proximate solutions to insoluble problems. I'm telling you, I would take it. I would take it in a minute on immigration, on climate change, on entitlements, on tax reform. The slow bleeds, the absence of good infrastructure in this country, setting our educational system right. These are nation killers over time, but they are not hot, irrepressible, relentless, unyielding crises. They do not do to our political system what the challenges of the late 18th century, the Civil War, Depression, World War II did. That's good. We don't need existential challenges. But we have to figure a way to comport ourselves to these problems that they don't continue to divide us as they do in this system. Thank you.
One more question, and then we'll start with the book signing.
So, sir, I've heard it said many times before that nature abhors a vacuum, and in the decline of greatness in our presidents, and looking at these challenges that our nation faces in the future, how would you see the role of our statesmen, those being our unelected officials, our leaders in the various departments, in tackling those challenges and moving forward and redefining how we see greatness in American leadership?
I mean, I think we have to restore a sense of confidence and faith in our institutions. The Constitution's been amended 27 times, and the first 10 came together in 260 some years. in the last time the Constitution was amended, I think was 1982. It had something to do with salaries of senators and representatives. We're not going to change our political system. We're not going to have mandatory voting. If we did, like the Australians, there's a $20 fine. People become conditioned to voting. It's a nothing, $20. But you know what happens when you have mandatory voting? The fact is the bases no longer control the primaries. You leaven things out. And since I have great faith in the wisdom and basic centricity of the American public, I think you'd get a much more functional politics with mandatory voting. You're not going to have term limits. You're not going to change presidential terms. We have a political system. It's imperfect. I would argue it's an extraordinary system. It's produced the most consequential nation still in the world. We're not declining, and I don't buy the declinist trope. I really don't. We have the best balance of economic, moral, political, and military power of any nation in the world, and we're going to retain that advantage for a long time. But we need to look inward to try to repair a dysfunctional political system. I don't know, frankly, how that happens. That's the basic problem. Someone asked me, well, maybe the best people don't run for elected office. I hear this all the time. The best among us shy away from the presidency. And you're dealing with a lot of greatness out there in our country, but they're either frustrated, they don't want to put up with what has become an unending campaign. When Jack Kennedy declared for the presidency, think about it, he declared in January of 1960. The elections were in November. I mean, we have 11 Republican candidates, and we're 18 months away from the election. It's a never-ending cycle. I would argue to you that the people who run for president are the set of people who are going to run for president. That the ambition, the drive, the sense of purpose, whatever it is, you have to have these things in order to want to get into the arena. So I do not believe that there are people out there who are somehow constrained. We have a system and we have leaders, and we're going to have to figure out a way to put the two together in order to improve the nature of our politics. If you ask me how to do it, I'm not sure I could. I would start with some measure of national service, not necessarily military service. I think that's incredibly important to restore a sense of shared sacrifice, shared obligation, and a shared sense of responsibility. It's not that this young generation is completely tuned out and not interested in an incredible array of worthwhile causes. The question is, can you link a younger generation to something that is related to the American national enterprise? That's the key. And it's increasingly difficult in a country this size, truly.
Well, let's give him a round of applause. I think that greatness exists in America, and you've seen an example of it tonight. Great thinking, great reflection upon some of the great issues and problems of the day, which is what we want to do here. I think that Dr. Miller is a little too humble about the book and its ability to help us think through some of these issues in an optimistic way. And so I encourage you all to get your copy. They're for sale right outside the door. He's going to be up here. We're not going to let him leave until you get his Aaron Miller, his John Hancock on every one of those things. So please, another round of applause for him. And